Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Leadership Analysis once more. This time is about socialism, communism, and capitalism. Of course, when we talk about socialism, we're talking about a state of government whereby much is given to the state, little to the people. And so, this, of course, had to thrive in the 18th century from Africa when you look at much more in terms of anthropology, and then later on migrated to the West or to Europe in the 19th century. Communism originates from the socialist tendency, and this, of course, has to do with the state owning everything. Not even a little comes to individuals, but much more is based on the fact that everything is owned by the government, and the government shares to everybody at their needs per se. Of course, then comes capitalism. Capitalism has to do with private ownership and individual ownership, of course, that had to merge in the 18th century with the Industrial Revolution. Now, but then, much more when we look at anthropology, it's much more back to the 16th century and a little more even in the 15th century. But again, we can see it in contemporary definition. We're talking between the 16th century to the 18th century, which emerges with Industrial Revolution. Now, you can understand it for yourself that capitalism, which has to do with individual or private ownership, gives a leverage for individuals to thrive in a better sense of competition and to emerge. Because when you have something that belongs to you, you better cater for it, and then you let it develop and you make some profit out of it. Meanwhile, with the other two systems, practically everybody owns almost everything, and so there's no good cater tendency being bestowed upon equipments, upon goods and services. Nobody's answerable. But when it's much more private, then individuals are answerable and there is a sense of competition. So there is a healthy competition that goes along the way. Now, with the populist view, it is difficult to continue so much with socialism or Marxist point of view in terms of economic development. That's why Donald Trump, being the arbitrator of this century, is trying to put in a lot of stringent and regulatory tendencies so as to balance in terms of economic policies, not only within America, but out of America or international trade per se. We talk about America having trillions of trade deficit, and this trade deficit, of course, partly based on the fact that she's doing a lot of social tendencies through the US aid around the world. Only in the year 2023, the US aid is about $44 billion around the world onto 160 countries. That's too much. Way, way too much. And if you were to sum that up, you understand why America is in the trillions of trade deficit. Now, Donald Trump, the greatest capitalist that has originated or that has merged, wants a difference. Of course, we wouldn't blame him. It's just that it may sound so sudden and that many countries are yet to adjust with his policy. However, I think that there is a way forward. And this way forward, of course, is for Donald Trump to give these nations that depend on US aid some time to adjust. In other words, there should be a come together between those countries and the US of A to discuss the way forward, rather than making it so sudden and very difficult for these countries at of a sudden, an impromptu tendency to be able to carry forward. We applaud the efforts of the US to have stood and continues to stand around the world in terms of health, food, and what have you, to support countries that are of a developing tendency in terms of economic strength. Now, how can Africa, Mother Africa that is so much into socialism, thrive at this moment. We depend so much on aid. Is it health or medicine? Is it about food? What have you? How can we do it better? I think that the USA and Africa should have a come together. My suggestion will be that at this point in time, while Donald Trump looks at the UN to be a little obsolete and difficult for him to operate and thrive within, Africans should be able to sit and partner with the US of A, okay, rather than trying to channel things so much through the UN, of which he's closing his doors so strongly, I would say. How can we do it? We have Ababa, which sits at the seat of the African Union. Let us look for a way to invite the US of A for a better discussion. Well, if you want to pass through the UN or the UN organs, it becomes a little difficult since Donald Trump is having it tight and tough with them. He's claiming so much from Europe, claiming so much from those who call allies or friends unto the US, because for him, it is like exploitation for so many years. And the America finds itself in trillions of dollars deficit per se. Now, can Donald Trump give us a chance? Can he work things with us? Or when I talk about us, I'm talking about Africans and getting to attend the African summit for a discussion with Africa. Well, think about it. Certain things have to be put in table as we discuss. We need a sense of transition. We need to put objectives in place to sustain what we may want to enjoy tomorrow as a capitalist world. Yes, we do like it, and that is why back or way back from the 16th century to the 18th century and developing into industrial revolution is the way forward. We've all benefited from it. Russia has emerged gradually. China has also emerged gradually, and China today is out of communism, and it is the second largest economy of the world. Now, I think that Africa should rise, and there should be a way forward. Africa should be able to turn to the IMF for a good sense of regulation in terms of its economy. While many Africans think that they have been cheated in the past as well, but I think it's also a moment whereby Africans should be able to sit with the IMF to revise certain issues. One of the tasks is based on the fact that there's going to be very soon a high demand in these various commodities like iron, steel, uranium, which African is a very good deposit in terms of this. Now the leverage is that we have iron, we have steel, we have uranium. As it is important that we strike a leverage using our strength and capacity with IMF rather than closing the doors with IMF like other nations may want to do for now. In other words, there should be a review in the days ahead in terms of price to iron, steel, and uranium. Very important. And so, since we have the deposit to these raw materials, there should be a deal under the IMF to give us demand and supply at a top chart. What do you think? As we arrange with the IMF, or as Africa arranges with the IMF, it is important to say that not much of liquidity or cash should be attributed to this arrangement. I think that it is time where there should be an industrial revolution in Africa based on the fact that after the First and Second World War, the Marshall Plan was put in place, but Africa was almost left aside. While the US, through its Marshall Plan, had to develop Europe and part of Asia, Japan had to benefit, and many others around the world. Now, I think it's time for Africa to benefit through the IMF and through a trade deal with the rest of the world. They should be given a chance. And I think that it is important that a deal is carried on. What do we have, Africa, in exchange of this industrial growth that should take place? We need the industries, we need the technology. It's important. And so, according to Donald J. Trump, when we see his recent outing, what do you have to offer? So we don't keep giving and keep giving and keep giving without any development on your path. What's the leverage? We have the raw material. Shall we move again to the West with our raw materials or have a sense of transformation? So we may not have the raw cash to bargain in terms of industries or the transfer of technology to Africa, but then we can bargain, we can do a deal. You bring the technology, we bring the raw material, and you produce it here in Africa. The truth is that so many of those countries that depend so much on socialism, all right, is based on the fact that there is no good governance. Leadership has it tough. Well, and so instead of having raw cash that is sometimes embezzled or mismanaged, or good governance is lacking, it is preferable that these industries be brought to Africa just like America did to China. Bring the industries. There, labor is cheap, employment is there, and transfer of technology starts. Rather than asking for raw cash, we just need to have a sense, or Africa just need to have a sense of evaluation to its raw material, and then invite major actors and industries to Africa to have their inbuilt or plant here, right in Africa, for things to take off. What is a disburden on African leaders or African Union having in mind when you see the way the West is beginning to look at things? Recently, ministers came together for a reform in terms of curriculum or curricular approach to higher education. Well, is it that we don't have a good curriculum for higher education? I think that we do. But the issue is the approach. The approach, that must be a pedagogic change in terms of approach. 80% practicals, 20% theory. In the past, it has been so much of 80% theory and 20% practical. That's why the results are difficult to harness. And even when we have graduates, be it postgraduates or undergraduates, they are still confused. Because when you have only theories, it becomes difficult for you to emerge or for you to be situated in mind on what has to be done. But when you have more of practicals, then it is easy for things to emerge after studies. Yes, like they often say, um, yeah, a lot of practicals gives an empowerment and a sense of orientation. Once you practice something, much more you become acquainted to, and you can develop your skills. It is practicals that enables individuals to be able to thrive and develop skills along the way. So I think that's what is needed for the education or higher education in Africa to develop. To add to is based on the fact that most of these graduates need a macro tendency in terms of economic strength. In the past, there have been so much in terms of micro. We want to give aid, we want to give boost to little economies, individuals to be able to develop enterprise and all of that. But I think that it's time for a macro sense of development. That is to engage central bank or to engage banks to see how the government can partner with banks for a macro tendency and no more micro. When you have a macro tendency, it develops from parastatals to corporations. That's the way forward. That's how America had to develop its economy. And from there, from a parastatal to corporation, and from corporation, then you can now talk about micro enterprises or little or medium sized enterprises that will emerge with a lot of strength. In other words, as an individual in developing countries, it is difficult for me to put forth a project, get all the necessary equipments, the bulldozers, what have you, the tractors, and all that which is needed for me to develop mechanized farming to that extent. But when you have the leadership will, which is, of course, state, banks, and the people, it moves to a macro tendency. And there you have an industrial capacity well harnessed, which will now be able to produce a harvest that the local population can benefit from, and the rest we export to develop a trade balance along the line. Now, that said, it is important that nations, African nations or developing world, should be able to sit with their ministers, just like CEMAC did a while ago, and this time to be able to speak a potential deal with a place like China or America to see how equipments can move from there to Africa under the leadership of the government to start a parastatal that will later on move to corporations and then corporations to micro. But when it starts from the way down to the way up, it is difficult to thrive. You don't have good regulations from the government, and of course, private entities do suffer. That's why so much has been poured to individuals to develop, and it has been a real difficult time for them. But when the state starts showing the example by getting all those heavy equipments put together, it becomes easy for a parastatal to develop, because we wouldn't want so much for the government to owe. Because if the government is going to own everything, then it becomes very difficult again for individuals to thrive. Then we're going to suffer with a socialist or communist tendency. So let us start with a parastatal, from a parastatal to cooperatives or corporations, and from corporations to micro. That is, in a micro tendency in the capitalist world, we're looking now for perfection. We're looking now for a competitive development from private entities that will be taken from parastatal or corporations and working much more to perfection. So we upgrade standards from top to bottom and not bottom to top. So we go macro to micro, and that's the way forward in the capitalist world. So our governments or African governments must meet to see how to pioneer, take the way forward.